I still don't know if it was bad luck or if something far more sinister had been at play all those years. When I was a kid, I didn't think much of it. The break-ins, the stolen tools, the occasional missing bike. It was just part of life in my neighborhood. You learned not to leave your things outside, to lock the doors, and to keep an eye out for strangers. It wasn't the worst place to live, not by a long shot. But now, looking back, I realize how much of my childhood had been shaped by the shadow of one man. I never knew his name. We never saw his face clearly enough to pin him down. But he was there, always there, creeping just outside the edges of normal life, slipping into the cracks of our routine like a sickness that refused to leave. The first time he invaded our home, I wasn't even born yet. My dad's truck was parked right in front of the house, locked, secure. Or so we thought. The next morning, the driver's side door was wide open, the contents of his work bag spilled across the seat, and the most valuable tools missing. My father was livid, of course, but these things happened. The police shrugged when we filed the report. Probably some local kid looking to sell for quick cash, they said. It happens. We should have realized it wasn't just some random thief. Years passed. I grew up knowing that we had to be cautious, that we had to double-check the locks at night. But I didn't understand why my dad took it so personally. Why, sometimes, he'd sit in the dark living room late at night, peering out the window like he was waiting for something. Then, one night, when I was still too young to understand what real fear was, my mother had an encounter that changed everything. She had been up late cleaning, moving from room to room, when she heard a soft noise from the bathroom. Not the pipes, not the usual house-settling creaks. Something different. Something deliberate. She turned the corner just in time to see fingers curling over the windowsill. A hand. Then an arm. A pale, skinny figure was halfway through the window, staring at her with wide, empty eyes. He wasn't masked, wasn't even trying to hide. A teenage boy, maybe early 20s, wearing a black hoodie. He didn't move. He just stared at her. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. My mother told me later that she wasn't scared, not in the way she thought she should be. She was angry. This was her home, and some stranger was climbing inside like he had a right to it. Then, slowly, as if realizing he had been seen, the boy backed out of the window, never breaking eye contact. And then he was gone. She didn't wake up my father, afraid that he'd chased the kid down and beat him senseless. My dad was a large man, 6 feet 6 inches, built like a truck, and fiercely protective. If he had caught the intruder, I don't think the police would have needed to worry about him committing another crime. But my mother told him in the morning, and that was the day my father became obsessed. Over the next few years, the same pattern repeated itself. My dad would catch glimpses of someone walking down the street at odd hours, trying car door handles, peering into windows. He'd sit by the window at night, waiting for the bastard to try something again. But for a long time, nothing happened. And then, when I was 6, we had our first real face-to-face encounter with him. It was late at night, and my parents and I were lounging in the living room, half asleep on the couch. The house was quiet, just the faint hum of the refrigerator in the background. Then, jiggle. The doorknob. Someone was trying to get in. Before my mother or I could react, my dad sprang from the couch and yanked the door open with so much force that it nearly flew off its hinges. And there he was, the same pale, lanky figure from years ago. His eyes went wide, and for a second he hesitated, like he hadn't expected anyone to actually open the door. Then he bolted. My dad roared, but he didn't chase after him. He knew better than that. Instead, he stood there, fists clenched at his sides, watching the intruder vanish into the night. The police were called, but there was nothing they could do. No cameras, no real evidence, they said. Could have been anyone. But we knew. We always knew. I grew up with him lurking just outside my life. Always there. Always just out of reach. At 12, I was sleeping on the couch one night when I woke up suddenly. Not to a sound, not to anything obvious, just a feeling. An unease crawling up my spine. And then, jiggle, bang, the door. My heart slammed against my ribs. I didn't even think. I jumped up and ran straight to my grandfather's room, shaking him awake. "Someone's at the door," I whispered, my voice barely working. He was out of bed in an instant. No hesitation, no fear, just fury. He stormed to the front door and wrenched it open, stepping onto the porch. But the night was empty. The street was silent. The air was thick with something unspoken, something that felt like it had just slipped away before we could catch it. Maybe it wasn't him, but deep down, I knew it was. Years passed, and I thought maybe, just maybe, he had moved on. But then, just last week, We woke up to find one of our cars missing. Stolen. And we knew exactly who it was. My grandfather, always the sharp one, had a friend across the street with security cameras. We checked the footage. 3:40 a.m. A tall, lanky figure creeping into the frame, peering into car windows. We couldn't see his face, but we didn't have to. He was still here, still watching, still waiting. And for the first time in my life, I wondered if he wasn't just some desperate thief. What if he wasn't just looking for something to steal? What if, after all these years, he had been looking for something else? For someone? For me? It started with a knock. Not the kind of knock you'd expect from a friend or a neighbor. This one was different. It was deliberate, slow, too forceful for someone just looking for the wrong apartment. 3 hard knocks, perfectly spaced apart. Bang, bang, bang. I groggily opened my eyes, confused at first. The room was dark except for the faint blue glow of my phone charging on the nightstand. I turned my head toward it, blinking to adjust my vision. 3:27 a.m. I lay there for a moment, still wrapped in sleep, wondering if I had imagined it. Maybe I'd been dreaming. Maybe someone knocked on the wrong door. I turned over, pulled the blanket up to my shoulders, and tried to ignore the creeping sense of unease settling in my stomach. Then it came again. Bang, bang, bang. Louder this time. I sat up, my body instantly awake, every nerve buzzing with alertness. My apartment was small, just a single bedroom space in an old complex with thin walls and a front door that had seen better days. There was no reason for anyone to be at my door this late. Then I heard the doorknob jiggle. I froze. The sound was unmistakable, the faint rattle of metal, the subtle twist of a handle being tested. Someone was trying to get inside. My breath caught in my throat as my mind scrambled for explanations. A drunk neighbor? A mistake? But no one should be trying to enter without saying something. The silence was the worst part. Whoever was out there wasn't calling out a name, wasn't apologizing for the mix-up. I forced myself to move, as quietly as possible, slipping out of bed and onto the cold floor. My feet barely made a sound as I crept toward the door. I kept my body pressed against the wall, making sure to stay out of direct view of the peephole. I listened. Nothing. Whoever was out there wasn't knocking anymore. They were just standing there. Slowly, I leaned over, just enough to glance through the peephole. He was right there. A man stood outside my door, close enough that I could see the rise and fall of his chest. He was tall, lean, with short blonde hair. His hoodie was dark, blending into the dimly lit hallway. His hands were in his pockets, and he was staring directly at the peephole. I recoiled instantly, my back pressing against the wall, my pulse hammering in my ears. He knew I was watching. The worst part wasn't his presence, it was his face. There was no anger, no frustration, no drunken confusion. Just an empty stare. Like he wasn't really looking at me, just through me. Then, without breaking eye contact, he knocked again. Bang, bang, bang. I backed away, my hands shaking as I reached for my phone. I didn't even realize how unsteady my breathing was until I tried to dial 911. I hesitated. Something about calling the police felt so final. Like it would escalate the situation, turn it from something eerie to something real. I waited. Seconds stretched into minutes. I stayed perfectly still, listening, barely even daring to breathe. Finally, I heard footsteps. Soft at first, then fading into the distance. I waited another 10 minutes before finally peeking through the peephole again. The hallway was empty. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I convinced myself I had overreacted. Maybe it had been some guy looking for the wrong apartment. Maybe it was harmless. Still, I double-checked my locks before going to bed. The knocking started at exactly 3:04 a.m. This time, I was already awake. My whole body tensed as the knocks rang through the room, deep and deliberate. Then, the doorknob turned. Hard. Not testing this time, pulling. I grabbed my phone and crept toward the door, angling it toward the peephole. If I didn't want to get too close, I could at least snap a picture. I pressed the shutter. My fingers shook as I pulled the phone back to look at the image. The man was even closer than before. He was right up against the door, his head tilted slightly, like he was listening. His mouth was slightly open now, his lips parted just enough to suggest he was about to whisper something. I swallowed hard. Then, for the first time, I heard his voice. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even fully formed words. It was muttering. A low, almost rhythmic whisper, the kind that sent chills down my spine because it felt intentional. I stepped back, holding my breath. Then, he yanked the doorknob. Hard. The door shook in its frame. The chain rattled. The deadbolt held. Then silence. I stayed there for what felt like hours. My body felt frozen in place, my mind screaming at me to move but unable to obey. Finally, I heard footsteps. He was leaving. I didn't sleep that night either. The third night, I wasn't alone. I called my friend Pete. He wasn't a big guy, but he had a sharp, gaunt face that always looked serious, even when he was joking. When I told him what had been happening, he didn't hesitate to come over. We stayed up, sitting in silence, waiting. And right on time, bang, bang, bang. Pete and I exchanged a glance. I undid the deadbolts, leaving only the chain. We waited. The doorknob turned. Then, in unison, we threw the door open, and Pete lunged forward with a knife. The man stumbled back, his blank expression finally changing, his eyes widening in shock. We didn't wait to see what he would do next. Pete slashed his knife through the gap in the door, the blade glinting in the dim hallway light. I grabbed a second knife and swung wildly, my voice rising into a scream. The man ran. He didn't say a word. He just turned and sprinted down the hall, disappearing down the stairwell. We never saw him again. I still don't know what he wanted, but I do know one thing. I wasn't the first person he had visited, and I sure as hell wouldn't be the last. I remember the exact moment I first saw him. It wasn't dramatic. There was no eerie music playing, no sense of immediate danger creeping up my spine. Just a quiet moment in a 24-hour Starbucks, the kind of place where tired strangers come and go in the dead of night, looking for a place to exist between dusk and dawn. I had been sitting there for hours, hunched over my phone, scrolling mindlessly while my backpack sat on the floor beside me. It was late, far too late, but I had nowhere else to go. Traveling on a budget was hard. No credit card, no proper hotel, and barely enough money to scrape by. I was supposed to be catching a Greyhound at sunrise, and the plan had been simple. Camp out in a coffee shop until it was time to go. I had done it before in other cities, and it had always been fine. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed him. He walked in like anyone else. Tall, blonde, clean-cut. Not conventionally handsome, but not unattractive either. His clothes were simple, his posture relaxed, like he belonged in the setting. He didn't have the erratic energy of a tweaker, nor the drunken sway of someone looking for trouble. But there was something off about him. At first, I couldn't place it. I kept my eyes down, pretending to focus on my phone, but I could feel him moving through the cafe. I wasn't alone. There were a few other scattered night owls, but no one seemed to pay him any attention. Then, a chill crawled up my spine. He was sitting next to me, not across the room, not at a respectable distance. Right next to me. The cafe was nearly empty. There were plenty of open seats. Why here? I turned slightly, offering a polite but tight-lipped smile, hoping that would be the end of it. He smiled back, too wide, too eager, and I knew I had made a mistake. "Hey," he said, his voice smooth, like he had done this 1,000 times before. I hesitated, unsure how to respond. "Hey, traveling?" he asked, nodding toward my backpack. I stiffened. I had never mentioned traveling. "Yeah," I said cautiously. He smiled again. "Yeah, I figured. Saw you at the beach earlier. Sunset, right?" My stomach turned to ice. I had been at the beach hours ago, alone. I had sat on a bench, watching the water, enjoying the final few minutes of sunlight before heading into the city. I hadn't spoken to anyone. I hadn't noticed anyone watching me. And yet, he had seen me. "Oh," I said, forcing a nervous laugh. "I didn't see you there." His smile didn't falter. "Yeah, I noticed." Something in my gut twisted violently. I noticed. The words felt wrong, deliberate, like he had been studying me. I forced myself to remain calm. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe he had just happened to be there. But then, the barista announced that they were closing. I turned, confused. 24-hour Starbucks? The employee apologized, explaining they had changed their hours. Everyone had to leave. I felt my stomach sink. I had nowhere to go. The man stood up with me. "Where you headed?" I didn't answer. I threw my backpack over my shoulder and made my way to the exit, trying to figure out my next move. It was almost midnight, and my bus wouldn't be leaving for 7 more hours. I had planned to stay here all night. As I stepped onto the dark sidewalk, he fell into step beside me. "Need a place to crash?" he asked casually, as if he were offering me a stick of gum. I stopped walking. "What?" He motioned down the street. "I've got a hotel room. Big suite, lots of space. You could hang there until your bus. My body locked. Everything in me screamed a no. I forced a laugh. That's really nice of you, but I'm fine. He smiled. That same, unwavering smile. It's no trouble, he said. Just a couch. Safer than wandering the streets all night. I hesitated. Because the truth was, he was right. I had no money for a hotel. I had nowhere to go. The only 24-hour places I had found were either closing or too far away. I had planned for this night to be easy, but now I was stranded, exposed. He knew that. He had seen me at the beach. He had followed me to Starbucks. He had watched me sit there, waiting for a place to go. And now, he was offering the only solution I had. I swallowed. Okay, I said, forcing myself to stay calm. Lead the way. He beamed. I walked beside him, hyper-aware of every step, every turn, every shadow in the dimly lit streets. His hotel wasn't far. A small, tucked-away building with a Chinese dragon statue by the entrance. It looked normal enough, and that made it worse. He led me inside, past the empty front desk, up the stairs to the second floor. My heartbeat pounded. I had no plan, no exit strategy. His room was large, just like he said. There was a couch in the living area, a small kitchenette, and a separate bedroom. I put my bag down by the couch. Thanks, I said, my voice light. I'll just crash here. He nodded, but didn't leave. Instead, he hovered. I could feel his eyes on me as I sat down. Bathroom's over there, he finally said. Oh, and don't drink anything from the mini fridge. They charge for that. Something about the way he said it made my stomach churn. I nodded. Got it. I waited for him to go into his room. Waited for the door to close. Finally, after a few long seconds, he disappeared behind it. I did not sleep. I sat on the couch, my backpack still slung over one shoulder, my body tense. I kept my phone in my lap, pretending to scroll, but I was listening. I could hear him moving. Not snoring. Not settling into bed. Just moving. Shuffling. Pausing. Breathing. My heart pounded. My stomach twisted. I knew that something was wrong. I had made a terrible mistake. At 4:30 a.m., my alarm went off. I grabbed my bag, stood up, and made my way toward the door as silently as possible. But as I stepped toward the bathroom to wash my face, he was already there, standing in the dim light, watching me. His expression was different now. The friendly smile was gone. His jaw was tight, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Don't steal anything, he said. His voice was cold. My blood turned to ice. I wasn't. Don't take anything that's not yours. I nodded quickly. Of course. He didn't move. I forced myself to walk past him, my hands trembling. I reached for the door, yanked it open, and bolted. I didn't stop running until I reached the Greyhound station. To this day, I don't know what his real intentions were. Maybe I don't want to know. But one thing still haunts me. How long had he been watching me? I woke up to the feeling of something cold pressing against my throat. For a moment, my brain struggled to catch up. Sleep still clung to my mind, and for a brief, blissful second, I thought maybe it was just the edge of my blanket or the metal clasp of my necklace. But then I saw him. Standing in the doorway of our bedroom, half hidden by the darkness, my girlfriend's father was watching me. I couldn't breathe. My mind screamed at me to move, to react, to do something, but my body wouldn't obey. I could feel my own heartbeat thundering against my ribs, the sharp sting of panic clawing up my throat. Then he lunged. I had only a second to process what was happening before the pressure at my throat deepened. A knife. The realization sent a jolt of electricity through my system. I gasped, my hands flying up to grab his wrist, to push him away, but he was strong, so much stronger than me. And he was angry. You took her from me, he snarled, his voice shaking with rage. You twisted her mind. You poisoned her. My girlfriend woke up at the sound of my strangled gasp, and then she screamed. Her voice was raw, filled with a kind of terror I had never heard before. She grabbed at her father's arm, ripping him off me with a strength I didn't know she had. I felt the knife slide away from my skin, leaving a sharp, burning line in its wake. My head spun. I barely registered the sound of her voice, frantic, panicked, begging. Dad, stop. What the hell are you doing? But he wasn't listening. His chest was rising and falling with deep, unsteady breaths. His eyes flicked between us, like he was still deciding what to do next. Then, without a word, he turned and walked to the corner of the room, and just sat down. He didn't run. He didn't try to fight. He just sank onto the floor, his knife still clutched in his shaking hands, and stared at the carpet. I pressed my hand to my throat, feeling something warm and sticky there. It wasn't deep, just a cut, but it was enough. Enough to know that if my girlfriend hadn't woken up when she did, I would be dead. She fumbled for her phone, her hand shaking so badly she could barely dial. 911. What's your emergency? I could barely hear the dispatcher over the sound of my own pulse pounding in my ears. My dad, she choked out. My dad just tried to, he has a knife. He tried to. I couldn't listen. I couldn't breathe. I stumbled out of the bed, my legs barely supporting my weight. I felt dizzy, nauseous. The world around me blurred, my vision swimming in and out of focus. But he was still there, sitting in the corner, watching. Even as the sound of approaching sirens filled the night, even as red and blue lights flickered through the blinds, even as uniformed officers burst through the door. He didn't move. It took 3 cops to pry the knife from his hands. They dragged him to his feet, snapping cuffs around his wrists. He didn't resist, didn't fight. And then for the first time, he looked at me, really looked at me. His expression was eerily calm. She was mine, he whispered. You took her from me. A shiver ran down my spine. The police pulled him away before he could say anything else. And then, just like that, he was gone. But the damage was already done. It had started years ago. Back in high school, when I first met her father, I knew something was off. He wasn't the typical overprotective dad. He didn't just glare at me or ask the usual, "What are your intentions?" questions. His dislike of me was deep, personal, visceral. At first, I thought maybe he was just the strict, military type. He had served overseas, and his time in Afghanistan had left him different, detached, cold. My girlfriend's mother tried to explain it to me once. He's not the same person he was before, she had said, her voice quiet, tired. We do our best, but She had stopped herself then, shaking her head, as if saying it out loud would make it worse. I tried to ignore it, tried to pretend that his constant staring at me wasn't unsettling. Tried to brush off his offhand comments about how my girlfriend was too good for me, about how ugly guys like me didn't deserve someone like her. Tried to pretend it didn't sting when she apologized for him, again and again, whispering, he doesn't mean it. He's just protective. I believed her. Until the stalking started. It began with the phone calls. Late at night, always from a blocked number. If I answered, there would be nothing but breathing on the other end. If I let it ring, it would go to voicemail, and the breathing would be there, too. Then, the sightings. We would be out late, coming home from a friend's house, and we'd see his car parked outside. One night, as we pulled into the driveway, the headlights of his truck flashed, and then he sped away. My girlfriend called her mom, panicked. And that's when we found out. He had been sneaking out of their house every night. He had been driving to our apartment. Every single night. Her mother was horrified. She promised us she would keep him from coming back. For a while, it worked. The phone calls stopped. The car disappeared. We started to feel safe again. Until tonight. Until I woke up to a knife at my throat. They diagnosed him with schizophrenia. That was the word they used. The explanation. The reason. He was sick. Unwell. Not in control of himself. It was supposed to make me feel better. It didn't. Because I kept thinking about the way he had looked at me. About the things he had said. She was mine. The worst part? My girlfriend felt guilty. She still loved him. Even after everything, she still cried when she visited him in the hospital. He wasn't always like this, she whispered. I wish I could have done something to stop it. I told her it wasn't her fault. I told her she had saved my life. I told her I would never let anything like this happen again. We got married last year. Her father wasn't at the wedding. He's doing better now, they say. The medication helps. The therapy helps. He even calls her sometimes, normal conversations, the way a father is supposed to talk to his daughter. But we don't visit. And at night, when I close my eyes, I still see him, standing in the doorway, watching me sleep, waiting for the right moment, holding the knife. It was late, too late, but I needed cash. I had been lying on my couch for hours, dreading the trip, but rent was due in the morning, and my landlord didn't take excuses. So, I grabbed my car keys, slipped on my jacket, and stepped into the night. The air was thick and humid, the kind of sticky summer heat that clung to your skin even after the sun had set. The streets were empty, silent except for the occasional buzz of a street lamp and the faint rustling of leaves in the warm breeze. I lived in a small town, the kind of place where people didn't bother locking their doors until recently. Crime had started creeping in from the outskirts, the kind that made you double-check your surroundings and walk a little faster when you were alone. I told myself I'd be fine. The bank wasn't far, just a quick drive down Main Street. I could already picture it, the dim glow of the ATM screen, the quiet hum of the machine counting out my bills. In and out. Easy. I turned onto the deserted road, my headlights slicing through the darkness. Everything looked normal, but as I neared the bank, a strange unease settled in my gut. The first ATM I pulled up to had a handwritten sign taped over the screen, out of order. I groaned. There was another bank a few blocks down, so I turned onto the next street, my fingers drumming against the steering wheel. The radio played softly, some late-night talk show discussing conspiracy theories, but I wasn't really listening. Something felt off. I pulled into the drive-through ATM lane, the engine idling as I rolled down my window. The screen glowed a sickly blue, casting eerie shadows inside my car. I reached for my wallet, sliding my card into the machine. And then, I heard it. A bark. Sharp. Sudden. But it didn't sound right. I froze, my hand hovering over the keypad. The sound had come from somewhere behind me, from the shadows beyond the bank. Another bark. Low and guttural, almost like someone trying to imitate a dog, but failing. I turned my head slowly, my pulse quickening. The alley behind the bank was dark, the kind of blackness that swallowed everything whole. The streetlights barely reached back there, leaving only vague shapes and shifting shadows. For a moment, I saw nothing. Then movement. A figure. Someone stepping forward from the darkness, their outline barely visible. My blood ran cold. I watched as the person emerged, their features flickering into view under the dim streetlight. A man, shirtless, dirty, and staring directly at me. He held something in his hand. A metal pipe? A crowbar? I couldn't tell. I didn't move. He barked again. The sound was worse this time, mocking, deliberate. And then, from the alley, another figure stepped forward. A second man, dressed in ragged clothes, his posture tense. He didn't bark, but he was watching me. Waiting. A chill crawled up my spine. The bark was a signal. I yanked my card from the ATM, my fingers shaking. My heart pounded in my ears as I reached for the gear shift, ready to peel out of there. But just before I could step on the gas, another car rolled up behind me. I glanced in the rearview mirror. A beat-up sedan had pulled into the ATM lane, its headlights flooding the back of my car. I squinted, trying to see the driver. The windows were tinted too dark, the interior barely visible. But I could feel eyes on me. The men in the alley didn't move. They just watched. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to get the hell out of there. But my card was still in the machine. I couldn't leave without it. My breathing was shallow, my fingers twitching. I forced myself to turn back to the ATM, punching in my PIN as fast as I could. The machine whirred, dispensing my cash at an agonizingly slow pace. In the mirror, I saw movement. The sedan's driver's side door cracked open. No. I snatched my money, barely bothering to count it, and threw my car into drive. The sedan's door swung open wider. The man in the alley took a step forward. I floored it. My tires screeched against the pavement as I sped out of the ATM lane, my heart slamming against my ribs. I didn't stop at the stop sign. I barely even slowed down. I risked one last glance in the mirror. The sedan hadn't followed me, but the driver had gotten out. I couldn't see his face, just his silhouette, standing perfectly still, watching my taillights disappear into the night. I didn't go home right away. I drove in circles for a while, checking my mirrors every few seconds, convinced I was being followed. The adrenaline made my hands shake against the wheel. By the time I finally pulled into my driveway, my body was buzzing with leftover fear. I locked the doors. Then I sat there, staring out into the night, thinking. It wasn't random. It couldn't have been. That bark, it wasn't just some weird guy making noises. It was a signal, a warning to someone waiting in that car. A setup. If I had hesitated even a second longer, if my card had gotten stuck, if I hadn't left when I did, would they have followed me? Would they have tried to box me in? Would I have even made it home? I don't know, and I don't want to. The next morning, I told my friend about what happened. He stared at me, then leaned forward, his voice low. That barking sound, he said. I've heard of that before. A chill ran down my spine. What do you mean? I asked. He hesitated. Gangs, he said finally. Or thieves. They use signals, whistles, claps, barks, to communicate without words. If they see a target, They make a sound to alert the others. My stomach twisted. They were watching me. I whispered. He nodded. Yeah, and they probably weren't just planning to rob you. I didn't go to an ATM at night again after that. And sometimes, even now, when I'm alone in a parking lot or walking to my car, I swear I hear it. That sharp, deliberate bark, echoing somewhere in the dark, waiting. I should have never brought my laptop. That's the thought that ran through my mind as I sat alone in the deserted dog park, the glow from my screen casting eerie shadows across the damp grass. My dog, Luna, trotted around the fenced enclosure, her ears perked, sniffing curiously at the cool night air. It was close to 11 p.m., far too late to be sitting outside in a park. But Luna had been restless all day, pacing around the apartment, whining at the door. My girlfriend had begged me to take her out before bed, and I figured I could multitask, let Luna burn off some energy while I got some work done. Bad idea. I glanced around. The streetlights barely reached the park, leaving most of it swallowed in darkness. The houses lining the street were quiet, their windows dark. I told myself I was being paranoid. This was my usual routine. It was safe. But then I saw him. At first, he was just a shadow moving along the sidewalk. A tall figure walking toward the park, his pace slow but deliberate. I tried to ignore it, focusing back on my screen, but I could feel him getting closer. Then, as he passed the entrance to the park, he did something that sent a chill crawling up my spine. He stopped, dead in his tracks. And then he turned his entire head to look directly at me. I swallowed, my fingers freezing over my keyboard. He stood there, staring, his face barely illuminated by the dim glow of a distant street lamp. He was wearing a Lakers windbreaker, unzipped just enough to show a dark shirt underneath. His hands were in his pockets, and he wasn't moving. Something about it was wrong. This wasn't casual curiosity. This wasn't the glance of someone simply passing by. This was deliberate, focused. I kept my posture relaxed, pretending I hadn't noticed him. But every muscle in my body was tensed, my senses heightened. He turned away after a few seconds, continuing down the sidewalk. But he didn't go far. 50 yards ahead, near the corner where the park's gate was, he stopped again. This time, he looked around. His head tilted slightly, scanning up and down the street, like he was checking for witnesses. A cold realization settled in my gut. He was deciding, calculating. I could almost see the gears turning in his mind. I had a laptop, a backpack, and no one else was around. I was alone. A perfect target. The air felt thicker, suffocating. Then, with one final glance around, he made his decision. He opened the gate and stepped inside. I barely had time to react. He wasn't running. He didn't need to. His pace was slow, but his steps were deliberate, closing the distance between us with eerie confidence. My breath hitched. My heartbeat slammed against my ribs. I knew what was coming. I wasn't just being paranoid. He was going to rob me. I had to act fast. Keeping my movements calm, I stood up from the bench, stretching as if I were about to leave. Luna, oblivious, ran to my side, her tail wagging. I took a casual step toward my backpack. And then, I grabbed the nearest shovel. It was an old, metal dog park shovel, left there by other pet owners to clean up after their dogs. Rusted, but heavy. I picked it up, resting it over my shoulder like a baseball bat. Then I turned to face him. He hesitated. It was subtle, but I saw it. The slight pause in his step, the way his gaze flicked from my face to the shovel. I could feel my pulse in my throat. My hands were slick with sweat, but I held my ground. I squared my shoulders, puffing out my chest, making myself look bigger. Then, in the most casual, almost friendly tone I could manage, I spoke. "Hey, man, how's it going?" He stopped. His expression didn't change. For a few tense seconds, we just stood there, the space between us crackling with unspoken tension. I could see the gears in his head turning again. He hadn't expected this. I wasn't running. I wasn't panicking. I was ready. The shovel rested lightly on my shoulder, but my grip was firm. I wanted him to know that if he took one more step, I wouldn't hesitate. He blinked. Then, slowly, too slowly, he took a step back. Then another. He kept his hands in his pockets, his face unreadable. And then, without a word, he turned around and walked away. Just like that. I stayed perfectly still, watching him leave. He stepped through the gate, back onto the sidewalk, and disappeared down the street. I didn't move. Not for a long time. My hands were still shaking when I finally bent down to grab my laptop and shove it into my backpack. I clipped Luna's leash onto her collar, my breath still uneven. Then I left. I walked home fast, checking over my shoulder every few seconds, my heart pounding in my chest. When I finally got inside, I locked the door behind me and collapsed onto the floor. I wasn't a tough guy. I wasn't a fighter. But I had matched his energy, and that had saved me. If I had acted afraid, if I had grabbed my things and ran, he would have followed. If I had frozen, if I had tried to reason with him, he would have overpowered me. But I had done the one thing he wasn't expecting. I had looked him in the eye and let him know I wasn't afraid to fight. That's what saved me. Even now, years later, I think about it. I think about the way he had stopped at the gate, looking around like he was making sure no one else was watching. I think about how calm he had been, how he had walked toward me like he had already decided how this was going to go. And I think about what would have happened if I hadn't stood my ground. I don't go to that dog park anymore. And I sure as hell don't take my laptop out at night.